I knew something was off the moment Mason Trent popped into Slack with that fake chummy, quick question tone, like a raccoon in a Gucci belt pretending to be management. I'd seen his kind before. Shiny title, zero memory of how anything actually works. The kind of guy who thinks compliance infrastructure is just a fancy word for Dropbox. He wrote, "Hey, who owns this compliance folder structure? Can we move it to our internal suite?" I answered with the kind of patience that only comes from 9 years of dragging companies like Virion through federal audits without losing a single bite, all licensed under Farview Systems LLC per Section 6B of the standing contract. Not a minute later, I saw him typing. Dot, dot, dot. Then a pause. Then more typing. Then he stopped. 2 days passed. No questions, no follow-up, no clarification. I figured maybe, just maybe, he'd taken the time to read the damn contract. Or, bare minimum, Googled my name before acting like he owned the infrastructure he'd just tripped over. Then came the email. Subject line, drive password auth transition. Body, please send over the credentials for the shared compliance drive ASAP. Also, we won't be needing your services going forward. Kindly pack up any remaining items. I laughed, loud enough to wake my cat. Now, before we get deeper into this firestorm, take a second to subscribe and like this video. 97% of people listen without subscribing, and it really motivates the team to keep digging up these absolute gems of corporate train wrecks. All right, back to Mason, Lord of the Shared Drives. I replied with one line, "No password. That drive falls under my company's contract. Talk to legal." No drama. No begging, just the plain truth served colder than a compliance audit in January. 5 minutes later, my inbox pinged again. He'd forwarded my response to legal, probably expecting a virtual high five. 10 minutes after that, legal forwarded it straight to the CEO with one line in bold, "You just fired your vendor." See, what Mason didn't know and didn't care to learn was that I was never a Virion employee. I was a ghost in the machine. Embedded, yes. Visible, rarely. But everything that made their audit trail sparkle like Christmas tinsel on SEC filing day, that was mine. My system, my protocols, my code. The moment he hit terminate, a series of internal triggers I'd built years ago started humming to life. Not in a malicious way, just by design. Fail-safes, offboarding protocols, credential collapses, the kind of digital tripwires that don't care how high up your name sits on the org chart. Mason thought he'd cut costs. What he'd actually done was sever the legal tether granting Virion access to every byte of their regulatory storage, and right on the eve of a new audit cycle. The kicker? His move violated Clause 7E of our agreement. Termination without cause within 60 days of a scheduled audit constitutes breach and triggers immediate license revocation. He didn't read it. He didn't know that the shared drive wasn't even hosted on Virion's servers. It sat in an AWS enclave under Farview's jurisdiction. Encrypted, redundant, untouchable. But that's part two. First, he had to learn what a digital silence sounds like when it stops being polite. He really thought I was bluffing. That's the part that still gets me. Like I'd just hand over a compliance drive tied to 3 federal audit trails and a decade of risk management, because some barely minted VP decided to swing his clipboard around like he built the place. After I refused to give up the password, he looped in 2 mid-level managers, Dan from Security Ops, who still calls every spreadsheet a doc, and Carrie from Records, who once asked if retention logs come in physical form. That was his dream team. And with a straight face, he fired off an email titled Ownership Transition Plan. Inside it, a bullet point list that read like a teenager trying to rewrite a lease agreement. Migrate folder ownership to internal IT. Assign new credential tiers. Remove vendor access. Clean handoff by Friday. I responded with a 4-page PDF. No emotions, just facts. First page, title, Active Contract Summary, Farview Systems, LLC, Virion Financial. Second page, highlighted Section 6B, all compliance structures, including but not limited to shared drives, tagging schemas, export logs, and archival sequencing remain the licensed intellectual property of Farview Systems, LLC. Third page, Section 8A, Credential distribution remains the sole discretion of Farview Systems LLC unless contractually amended by both parties. Fourth page. Termination clause. 11C. Any termination without cause within 60 calendar days of a scheduled audit cycle triggers immediate and full revocation of access. I wrote no personal commentary, just attached for clarity. He didn't read it. Didn't ask a single follow-up question. Instead, he forwarded it to legal with a little flourish. Let's terminate this clown. First of all, bold words from a man whose desktop still had 3 tabs open to how to open .7z files. Second, the moment that email hit legal's inbox, the countdown started. That contract was a fortress. 9 years of language refined through blood, fire, and SEC subpoenas. When I drafted it with my legal counsel back in 2014, we knew this day would come. Maybe not with Mason, maybe not with Virion, but somewhere, someday, a cost-cutting executive would see external vendor and think expendable. So we built in teeth, and Mason just bit down. See, the license to use my compliance system wasn't permanent. It was conditional, non-transferable, and explicitly tied to my company, not me personally. So when Mason tried to cut me out without renegotiating, he effectively nullified the contract. And that one clause, termination without cause prior to audit cycle voids all access with immediate effect, wasn't just legal poetry. It was the core failsafe. The minute his email hit my inbox, I didn't need to make a decision. The system made it for me. I didn't yell. I didn't call. I didn't respond with fire. I just did what I was trained to do. I archived everything. Local backups spun up. External syncs paused. Credential lifespans clipped to 0. Every live access token linked to Viren's internal IP ranges was flagged and decommissioned in 27 seconds. They didn't notice yet. But the audit system sure would. By the time Mason finished patting himself on the back for eliminating a redundant vendor, the very tools keeping their regulatory skin intact were dissolving under his feet. And me? I went to lunch, left my phone on Do Not Disturb, and watched the quiet unraveling begin. 3 days. That's how long it took before the smoke from Mason's little bonfire finally reached the alarm sensors. At 9:12 a.m. on the dot, one of the analysts tried to access the audit interface to run the monthly compliance digest for internal review. It was supposed to be automated. Quiet, invisible. Just a scheduled routine pulling tagged financial artifacts, export logs, and event trails into a tidy PDF bundle for executive eyes. Instead, they got a 404, not the try again later kind of error. No, this was the digital equivalent of a locked vault door with the hinges melted off. No credentials worked. No backups loaded. The interface wasn't down. It was gone. Then the pings started. First from Beth, the junior analyst who usually runs audit prep like a church bake sale. She sent a polite, "Hey team, anyone know why the compliance portal is offline?" In Slack, no one answered, because no one knew. Second ping came from Raymond in data risk, less polite. More, who touched the export triggers? Then came the third, and that's the one that made Mason feel the first bead of sweat. Does anyone still have access to the compliance backbone structure? Now, Mason, who thought saying things confidently made them true, replied in under 30 seconds. That's handled. We're restructuring the system to bring it in-house. Seconds later, legal dropped in like a guillotine. Handled how? It was almost elegant, that line. Cold. Surgical. The kind of question that doesn't need an answer. It's already the answer. And in that moment, Mason realized he didn't even know what the system was, let alone how to restructure it. The export triggers had failed because they were tied to my LLC's credential vault. The moment his email landed in my inbox, those triggers expired, not out of spite, not out of emotion, out of contract. The auto-tagging system, the thing that sorted, categorized, and time-stamped every critical doc in Viren's compliance universe, was built on my tagging framework. And when the license revoked, the scripts stopped running. Data went raw, unfiltered, unverifiable. Mason tried to salvage face. He messaged IT privately, asking if they could just rebuild the directory architecture manually. They tried. Bless them. But all they found was an empty shell. No schemas, no stored logic. Just a cold, hollow space where everything used to be. Because here's the part nobody ever wants to admit. Systems don't argue. They don't explain. They don't warn you twice. They just stop. And when that happens, all the flashy PowerPoint decks and Friday stand-ups and we'll take it from here declarations collapse into silence. The kind of silence you can't bluff your way out of. Mason tried to get me on the phone 3 times. I didn't answer. He emailed. I didn't reply. Because at this stage, it wasn't my problem anymore. It was theirs. All of it. Every missed export, every failed backup sync, every red flag that was about to show up when the feds ran their first ping on Virion systems that week. I didn't need to raise my voice. The void was doing it for me. They pulled the termination notice at 7:43 a.m. the next morning. Legal, that is. I imagine it hit them like a baseball bat wrapped in red tape and fire codes. Turns out Mason had sent it unilaterally. No board approval, no audit committee heads up, not even a courtesy CC to the chief compliance officer. He'd yanked the pin out of a live grenade thinking it was a balloon, and now the legal team was standing in the blast radius wondering why their regulatory infrastructure had evaporated overnight. First came the panicked scroll through the contract. All 9 pages of it, dense, legalistic, and signed by Virion's own CFO back in 2015, during saner times when the company still understood the cost of cutting corners. It was the kind of document people like Mason don't bother reading because it doesn't have bullet points or buzzwords. But deep in that contract, Section 7D and the real bombshell, Clause 8C, was the truth. Termination without board or committee sign-off. Immediate and binding. Vendor notified without mutual wind-down clause. Access revoked. Credentialed systems decommissioned under vendor authority. Non-recoverable without renewal. Clause 8C spelled it out in plain language. All encrypted environments hosted by vendor are subject to access, key destruction upon breach. Restoration requires written renewal under new terms. Translation? You don't get the toys back until you ask nicely. And this time, they cost more. Mason lost it. He called IT and demanded they override the credential architecture. I'd have paid to see their faces, because those systems weren't built on Virion's cloud. They were rooted in my private AWS enclave, segmented, hardened, and keyed through a vault that required dual token restoration from my hardware device and legal confirmation of renewed contract terms. No key, no entry, no exceptions. IT gave him a lot of soft language like, we'll explore that, and maybe there's a workaround, but I know how that conversation really went. They couldn't touch it. Not because I was malicious, but because I was smart. Because I'd spent 9 years watching revolving door executives swing through Virion like it was a pit stop between podcasts and IPO dreams, and I knew someone would eventually try this exact move. So I planned for it. Quietly. Legally. Precisely. Meanwhile, legal started tearing through email chains. They ran backward through permissions, looking for someone, anyone, who had greenlit Mason's brilliant little purge. Nothing. The only signature on the termination was his, and that meant the liability was too. I didn't move a muscle, didn't log in, didn't even refresh my inbox because I didn't need to. The systems had already done what they were designed to do, protect themselves. The access keys weren't just gone. They were gone by design. Unpaid access doesn't get a grace period. It gets a firewall and a log timestamp. And now, Virion wasn't just staring down a data blackout. They were staring down a legal one. Mason tried a last-ditch call. I let it ring out. He followed up with a weak email. Can we discuss a short-term fix to re-enable your systems? I forwarded it to my legal team. No reply needed. The containment was ruptured, and the vultures were circling the audit calendar. From the outside, it still looked calm. No press releases, no headlines. But inside that building, people were sprinting backwards through contracts, message logs, committee minutes, any scrap of paper that might tell them how they let a smug VP pull the regulatory Jenga block without checking if it was glued down. But that block? That was mine. And it was never glued. It was booby-trapped, with clauses. He tried again at 8:17 a.m. sharp. Like maybe if he was early enough, earnest enough, I'd forget he'd pulled the pin and tossed the grenade into his own server room. I didn't answer. At 9:02, another call. Declined. 9:19, an email. Subject, let's reconnect. Body. Hey, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Can we talk for a few minutes today? I want to work this out. I read it once, sipped my coffee, typed exactly 7 words in reply. You'll need to speak to legal counsel. That was it. No signature, no emojis, just the digital equivalent of a brick wall. And the silence that followed wasn't just his. It was the entire floor of Virion's C-suite holding its breath, pretending this wasn't spiraling into something they couldn't contain. Because by then, the real damage wasn't the locked systems. It was the audit clock. Federal compliance doesn't pause because someone got cute with a contract. And Virion had less than 48 hours before the pre-audit data pull began, which meant no breadcrumb logs, no export trail, no timestamp ledger, no conditional access matrix. Just nothing. At 11:24 a.m., the general counsel, Elise Gordon, whose calm is known to make grown men sweat, forwarded Mason's original "Let's terminate this clown" email to the CEO. No long commentary, no rage, just one sentence. You just fired your vendor. I wasn't in the building, but I didn't need to be to feel the shift. 4 minutes later, the CEO's assistant blocked off a meeting on 8 calendars with the title, Emergency Infrastructure Review. Time, 4 p.m., location, exec conference. South attendees, CEO, legal, CIO, Mason Trent, compliance, and, yes, me. I got the invite at 11:39. No message, no note, just the calendar entry. That's how you know they've moved past denial and straight into damage control. Meanwhile, Mason went dark. No Slack, no more emails, no more, hey team, pings. Just digital absence where there used to be bluster. Words started getting around, quietly at first. The analysts whispering to data ops, IT nudging compliance, that weird feeling when everyone knows someone stepped in it, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. By 2 arg, I got a text from a former coworker still inside. Is it true the archive system's down? I didn't reply. The silence had weight now, because people had questions. And the guy with answers wasn't in the building anymore. I wasn't smug. I wasn't gloating, but I wasn't moving either. I'd done nothing except follow the contract. He fired the vendor left. The vendor's system locked itself. Simple math. At 3:22, another email from Mason. Please disregard the earlier termination. We are prepared to discuss a solution today if you're available. I didn't even open it. My attorney did, because that's how you know the house is on fire, when the guy who lit the match suddenly wants to discuss options. And now, all eyes were on 4 p.m. because that meeting wasn't just about infrastructure, it was about control, and the realization that the most critical system in their organization didn't belong to them. It belonged to the woman they just tried to erase. They were out of time. At precisely 7 a.m. the next morning, the audit notice hit. Not a warning, not a request, a declaration. Preliminary validation window begins 8:30 a.m. EST. Please prepare active infrastructure for compliance traceability testing. And just like that, the countdown wasn't theoretical anymore. It was a fuse, lit and burning, with one end tied to Virion's reputation and the other sitting in my pocket. What Mason never understood, and what legal was now scrambling to explain to the rest of the executive team, is that without my archive sync module, Virion's entire regulatory reporting engine was just decorative. The retention logs? Gone. The metadata chain of custody? Gone. The embedded compliance triggers that timestamped every modification inside their loan risk platform? Gone. Sure, the files still existed, but without the system I built, without the code that proved when and how they were created, accessed, or amended, they were meaningless, like having a box of receipts in a fireproof safe with no dates on them, non-compliance. And under their own regulatory charter, Section 14E, written in proud bold font during the last merger, any failure to provide verified archival trail on demand was subject to a $1.2 million fine. Per audit cycle. That's when the panic reached combustion. I wasn't in the room for what happened next, but the sequence was pieced together for me later by 3 different sources, all whispering, all wide-eyed. At 9:14 a.m., legal finished their damage assessment and looped in finance. By 9:23, the CFO was asking, do we really have no way to restore this ourselves? By 9:31, the CIO confirmed that all credentials related to the core compliance framework were non-functional. encrypted, tied to a credential store inaccessible without Farview Systems' signature approval. That meant me. And at 9:42, in front of the whole exec team, the CEO, normally composed, clinical, the kind of man who reads earnings reports like bedtime stories, set his tablet down and said it out loud. "What's the solution?" The room held its breath. The clock ticked forward. Then Elise from legal looked him straight in the face and said, "Talk to the person you just terminated. Not consult, not engage, talk." Because they weren't dealing with a vendor anymore. They were dealing with a former partner holding the only key to the one system no one else ever learned how to operate. Mason, by then, was basically furniture. He didn't speak. Couldn't. He was still scrolling the contract like it was going to rearrange itself into something friendlier. The CEO asked one more question. "Can we negotiate internally to rebuild what we lost?" Legal shook their heads. "Not before the audit. Not without her. The IP belongs to Farview. The architecture is proprietary. Rebuilding would take 6 months minimum, and even then, it wouldn't meet retention validation." So the walls closed in, not with shouting, not with slamming fists, but with the sound of white-collar desperation, soft keystrokes, whispered questions, and the hollow echo of systems no longer responding. They had one option, one door left to knock on, mine, and they knew it. That afternoon, I got the call, not from Mason, from the CEO himself. "We'd like to speak with you, today." His voice was calm, but I could hear it in the background. Papers shuffling, people moving too fast for comfort. The house was still standing, but the foundation, cracked and sinking, and they were finally ready to admit who poured the concrete. I walked in at 4:03 sharp through the east elevator, the same one I used back when I was a ghost in their machine. No badge, no escort. Just a silent nod from the front desk, like the building itself knew I wasn't there for small talk. The exec floor was quiet in that tense, fluorescent way that only happens when everyone's already been yelled at. Mason wasn't in sight. Good. This wasn't going to be about him anymore. It never really was. The CEO stood when I entered the conference room. Not out of respect, out of necessity. You stand when the person holding your parachute walks in. "We need you operational by 8 a.m., he said. No fluff, no preamble. I didn't nod, didn't smile, just pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. One page, plain language, my language. "Reinstatement under consulting retainer," I said, tapping the first line with my index finger. "Fee is 4 times my previous rate. Term, 90 days minimum with rolling weekly renewals thereafter." He scanned it in silence. "Conditions?" he asked. "Autonomy, no oversight. And no contact with your VP of operations, directly or indirectly. If I even get CC'd on a memo with his name on it, I'm gone and the system goes dark again. Permanently." He didn't blink. He just signed. One stroke. Full name, and that was the moment the balance shifted. Not a storm, not a victory lap, just the quiet click of authority realigning itself. I pulled my hardware token from my coat pocket, plugged it into the port beside the CEO's tablet, and authenticated into the Farview credential vault. A blue light blinked once, twice, then went solid. I reinitiated the archive sync. Backups resumed. The compliance backbone rebooted. Export triggers came online. Retention markers lit up like runway lights in a fog. No applause, no thank you. That wasn't the currency here. I packed up the folder, pocketed the token, and turned to leave. The CEO extended a hand. I didn't take it. "Payment clears by midnight," I said over my shoulder, "or the next heartbeat you hear will be from a federal auditor, not me." He didn't argue. And me? I didn't linger, didn't ask how Mason was doing, didn't wait for someone to play peacemaker or offer coffee. I walked back to the elevator the same way I came in, unseen, unbothered, undeniable, because I don't save face, I restore function, and they just remembered why they kept me in the first place. At 8:02 a.m. the next morning, the audit team logged into the compliance interface without so much as a hiccup. The system spun up clean, metadata chains intact, timestamps verified, export logs fully reconciled. The sync report blinked green across all indicators. No gaps, no latency, no suspicious file activity, just silence. the good kind, the kind that says everything's working exactly as designed. At 9:11 a.m., I saw the first ping come in from the lead auditor, requesting archive digest for July-October cycles. I hit execute. The system pulled every tagged asset, matched every entry to its audit trail, and generated the compliance digest in under 90 seconds. At 10:12, as they reviewed the export on their end, the compliance lead leaned over to Virion's in-house counsel and whispered, thinking their mic was off, but it wasn't. Whoever built this knows what they're doing. I didn't smile. I just watched the logs roll. They passed the validation phase with 0 flags, 0 holds. The audit team didn't ask a single follow-up question. That kind of perfection doesn't come from templates. It comes from scars, from knowing where systems break before anyone else sees the cracks, from building them with enough foresight to keep even the dumbest executive decisions from turning into legal disasters, at least until someone forces your hand. Which brings us to Mason. By 2:30 p.m., he was officially removed from day-to-day operational responsibilities. That's what the company-wide email said, but I know what it really meant. He was done. Dissolved. The role of VP of Operations was restructured. No replacement named, just silence where his Slack status used to be. Legal followed up with a formal internal memo recommending external custodianship for critical compliance infrastructure until further notice. I wasn't copied, of course, but I was told. Loudly. By 4 p.m., my LLC, Farview Systems, was issued a new standing contract. Term, through fiscal year 2027. Conditions, uninterruptible autonomy, fixed rate escalators, mandatory consultation for any internal architecture changes. Clause 5.4 even included a new line. In the event of premature termination, vendor may retain system custodianship for up to 120 days post-notice. That's 4 months of paid protection, just in case someone gets bold again. And no, I didn't push for that clause. Legal offered it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just sat at my desk, my own desk, not in their office, never in their office, and logged the latest sync report into Farview's continuity tracker. They could have had this piece the whole time. But some people only learn the value of boundaries after they've been electrocuted by one. So no, this wasn't revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about reminding a billion-dollar firm that the foundation they stand on has an owner. And she just renewed her lease. 2 weeks passed like smoke through glass. No drama, no flare-ups, just the quiet, humming order of a system finally left alone to do its job. I'd received a few polite check-ins from legal about clarifying dependencies, which really just meant they were finally cataloging the architecture they'd ignored for years. Compliance was quiet. Audit was clean. Even finance, usually allergic to anything not instantly billable, sent a thank you note through their liaison. Handwritten. That was a first. And then, mid-Tuesday, 3:47 p.m., the inevitable ping. A Slack message from someone I didn't recognize. New hire, fresh badge, probably still trying to figure out where the restrooms were without asking the floor. Message said, "Hi, just wondering who to talk to about shared access to the retention kernel." No, please. No signature block. Just that soft, oblivious tone of someone who hadn't read the last month of meeting minutes. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds. Not out of anger, not even amusement, just reflection. Because that kernel he was asking about, that was the very spine Mason tried to rip out like a loose cable. The thing that nearly dragged the entire company under regulatory fire. And now here was this kid, probably fresh from orientation, trying to peek inside it like it was a Google Doc. I typed slowly, clearly. Requests are reviewed quarterly via legal proxy. I'll add you to the waiting list. I didn't get a reply. I didn't expect one. Somewhere in Viren Systems, a new page had been added to their internal wiki, probably titled something like Compliance Infrastructure, Request Procedures. And in that document, I imagined someone had to finally spell it out. This system is externally licensed. All access is custodial. All changes require legal approval, because that's what I built. Not just software, not just backup scripts, a perimeter, a gate with one key, and it was mine. That night, I logged into the master interface to check performance. Just routine. No issues. But my eyes lingered on the top right of the dashboard, just long enough to appreciate the words in blue text. Custodial access controlled by Farview Systems LLC, active through 12/2027. Not their logo, not their CTO's initials, mine. They wanted a password. What they needed was permission.